So my last task for this workshop is to summarize from what we've heard today in this wonderful workshop is what are some of the research gaps and opportunities in the area of breakfast. These are not all inclusive. I did my best based on what I've heard today and what I know of the literature. So I'm going to ask you all, based on what you've heard from this workshop, is breakfast really the most important meal of the day? Yes, raise your hand. No. Don't really know after this meeting. Okay, fair response. Okay, basically, if you look at it, is it based on nutrient intake, nutrient adequacy? Personally, I think there's adequate evidence that's suggesting that breakfast does have an impact on nutrient intake and nutrient adequacy. You know, if I were to grade it, I would give it a grade A. As far as body weight, I think we need to do a lot of work on the relationship between breakfast and body weight. Once again, there's the issue of reverse causality, and nobody's really looked at that in the literature. I think you know after my talk and Sandra was wonderful, by the way, you helped me understand my talk. But I mean, is the evidence consistent between cognition and academic performance? So what we eat in the morning may be more important than when we eat it. So how do we really define breakfast? I mean, I'm more confused today than I was yesterday. So if, as a scientist, in research, especially in these national surveys, they have arbitrary criteria, particularly the researchers do. They come up with some criteria, like I know a study that I worked with, it was breakfast constituted at least the energy content of a glass of milk. Okay, or does the participant define what a breakfast meal is? And if they do define a can of Coke as breakfast, that's what they had for breakfast. So once again, you have the quandary here. Is it participant versus researcher's definition for breakfast meal? Here we go, the breakfast types. No one has looked at brunch. You have the American, the continental. You have the English breakfast or full breakfast. You got the buffet breakfast, the typical, the brunch, and the traditional. So the type of breakfast meal does vary considerably depending upon where it's defined. And then finally, do we define a breakfast meal using some nutrient criteria? If so, what is the justification for using that nutrient criteria? Moreover, I would take it a step further. Why did you select those nutrients over other nutrients? And where does fortification fit in? And where does absorption of various nutrients fit in when you eat foods in combination, because we know that most people don't eat food in isolation. Did I slip one? Okay, so are traditional breakfast foods any different than dishes that are generally consumed later on in the day? Cake or pepperoni pizza versus pancakes or eggs and bacon. Japan, you have different types of breakfast foods. Cambodia, different types of foods for breakfast. Same with Indonesia, and same for India. So the next question that I walk away with, and I can't answer it, is what qualifies as a good breakfast? To me, it's an ambiguous term on how you define the word good. So is eggs and bacon good? Well, it depends upon what nutrients you're looking at. I mean, eggs and bacon, bacon has fat and salt, and eggs have cholesterol. But turn it around the other side, and eggs, we heard, is high in protein. Bacon, it does provide us with energy, and some of us need energy throughout the day. So the point I'm making is, what nutrients do you select, and what is the rationale for selecting them? Leftover pizza, A lot of people think pizza is not a good food. What's interesting is if you take each ingredient out, it may be good based on some criteria, but if you take them out, the single food may not be a healthy food, however you call that. But once you put them together in that big round old pizza, it may become a healthy food because one offsets the other. Yogurt parfait, roasted chicken, muffins, pie, and vegetables and rice. So I think if you go away with one message, but hopefully more than one message, is that breakfast meals are not homogeneous and they do vary considerably. As I mentioned, we identified 12 breakfast patterns among children with varying nutrient profiles and with some of them associated with weight. So, science in our world, the certainty versus the controversy. Does breakfast skipping cause weight gain? We know there's equivocal findings. They're primarily from observation studies, and majority of these studies have been misinterpreted. Some have found associations between breakfast skipping and gaining weight, while others have not. And a small number of randomized trials have continued to cast doubt on the protective effect of breakfast. So the inconsistency noted in past research may be due to these recent observations. People who eat breakfast tend to eat more than breakfast eaters later in the day. Those who eat breakfast tend to be more physically active early in the day than breakfast skippers. And that some people actually lose weight when skipping breakfast because even if they eat more at lunch, it's often not enough to make up for the average breakfast. So what about protein intake? Most protein requirement studies did not control for energy intake, which is a major limitation of the protein studies. Should the recommended allowance for protein be revisited for children? The impact of protein distribution and quality across the day on physical growth in children needs to be further examined. And more studies are needed on children to determine the ideal protein dose, timing, and distribution throughout the day to optimize protein utilization. And we also need to look at the long-term effect of protein intake. So I don't know about you, but I often wonder if there really is a direct relationship between eating breakfast and gaining weight. And as I mentioned several times, this also leaves open the possibility of reverse causality because maybe weight gain is causing you to not eat breakfast. The results being due to chance is always an option, as well as third variables which affect both weight gain and whether or not you eat breakfast. And then finally, we have the whole issue of underreporting of energy intake. So I'm going to take 3 different types of studies and show you what are some research recommendations. One is with acute intervention studies. We have most studies with overrepresentation of children. We need to include adolescent samples. We need to include low-income samples and/or nutritionally at-risk populations. We need to have studies sufficiently powered that use larger samples. We need to do power calculations based on effect sizes. More field-based studies in schools in the real environment. More realistic ad libitum breakfast manipulations, and the use of cognitive function tests with proven sensitivity and examines a variety of cognitive domains. If you look at chronic intervention studies, particularly school breakfast programs, we need to have randomized controlled trials with a robust evaluation. We need evidence-based theoretical framework to produce change in breakfast eating. We need to isolate out both acute versus chronic effects. And if we look at cross-sectional studies, we need to use validated dietary measures that assess both frequency and composition of breakfast intake. We need to use a standardized definition of breakfast. We need to use a definition of breakfast post hoc, looking at the threshold amount of food and/or the time of day. And we need to have research driven both on the selection and the accurate measurement of a range of confounders to include in the analysis. And on a final note, I need to think when it comes to breakfast, we need to take a socio-ecological model, just like we do for food and physical activity. We need to do the same with breakfast. There's different levels. You have the social and cultural norms and values, which includes a whole host of different variables that we need to look at. In addition, we need to look at different sectors, different systems, different organizations, different businesses and industries. And then finally, different settings. We need to look at it in the homes, early care, schools, work sites, and so on and so forth. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for a wonderful session that we had today. If it wasn't for you, this could not have happened. And also to NNI. And wait, before you start clapping, I want to personally clap to the media people who have been extremely wonderful, particularly since they've helped me a lot. I mean, I know I'm probably the worst in the room. I know very little about computers. I know how to turn it on and turn it off. But I also gave them one of the most complicated presentations, which included the internet and several interactive PowerPoints. So personally, I'd like to thank you all.
Thank you very much.